Can everybody hear me? And if so, I would like to welcome you all. If you're here, is because you already know, but this is the second International Conference of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, also known as NPACS, which is the premier global association dedicated to bringing together researchers, practitioners, and decision makers working on issues of environment, conflict, and peace. Founded in 2018, the association is a multidisciplinary forum with three main aims. First, it seeks to identify promising research avenues and best policy practices, as well as foster exchange of knowledge and data. Second, it builds capacity and awareness among practitioners to advance the field and increase impact. And third, it fosters interactions among scholars, practitioners, decision makers, and others across disciplines, genders, geographical locations, and stages of professional development. And in particular, this third area is where we find that this panel to fall right into it, because we are here to exchange some very exciting research. My name is Emmanuel Davalillo Hidalgo. I am a senior regional specialist at the United States Institute of Peace, and we're pleased to facilitate this virtual research panel discussion, which we have titled just Environmental Peacebuilding, Rights and Justice. And this place will be the ideal setting for us to not just learn from our amazing panel that we have assembled right here, but also to exchange ways in which the research in this field can become even stronger and to build the evidence base, as well as to continue promoting the rights and justice agenda. So I'm joined today by Alejandro Fuentes, who is an Argentinian researcher based at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden. He'll be discussing the environmental law and human rights and the interpretive paradigms and jurisprudential developments within the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We also have Hector Herrera and Juliana Galindo. Hector is based at the Institute of Development Policy in the Antwerp University, but is from Colombia. And Juliana Galindo is from the Guernica Center for International Justice, is also based in Colombia. They will be discussing their research on nature as victim in the Colombian armed conflict, the case of attacks against oil infrastructure. We also have with us Mariana Montoya, who is from the Universal Rights Group, and she will be discussing her research on understanding and identifying good practices in support of environmental human rights defenders, or EHRDs, and their local communities. And last but not least, we have Tobias Bowman, who is based at the University of Essex in the UK, and he will be telling us a bit about how can UN peacekeeping promote environmental quality in the areas where these operations are deployed. So without much further ado, I believe we do have some housekeeping things to bear in mind. If Joe can be, there you go. He is our tech support lead, and he is helping us right now sharing the screen. Just a word of reminder on compliance. By registering and participating in this session, you have agreed to abide by the NPACS anti-discrimination harassment policy. We will put the link on the chat, which Joe just has dropped there if you'd like to take a look. But we just really hope that we can have this conversation in complete mutual respect and collaboration with that spirit in mind. And just, you may review the policy if you'd like, but let's just keep everything within all the exchange and the good spirits that we know it's part of the reason why we're all here together. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Alejandro so he can get us started today, and he can present us his research. So Alejandro, over to you, and thank you everyone for joining.
Microphone. Thank you. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Microphone is always the last things that we remember. So as Emmanuel presented today, I will talk a little bit about the latest jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights regarding the protection of the environment in the context of the protection of indigenous people's rights. I'm a lawyer, so it's a legal approach, and I'm using legal methods of interpretation. I will talk a little bit about them throughout the presentation. But basically what I will present today in the 10 minutes that I have at my disposal is how the protection of the environment as developed in the recent jurisprudence of the court, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights based in Costa Rica, has enhanced the protection of indigenous people's rights and enhanced the safeguards that states should put in place in order to respect, protect, and fulfill their rights. And be aware that this is not only right-based construction, but it's a jurisprudential-based construction. It's based on the interpretation developed by in this case, a regional court, a human rights regional court, that to a certain extent do not have anchor on the text of the instruments that the court apply. So it's a Praetorian, if you want, development that could be justified through methods of interpretation of international human rights law. A key piece that I will discuss through this presentation is the latest advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, number 23 from 2017, in which the Inter-American Court specifically addressed the environment and human rights. And based on the interpretation that the court provided in this advisory opinion, remember, advisory opinions are not a contagious jurisdiction. Therefore, it's not about a case against a state, but it's about how the court interprets its own instrument. And therefore, the court will apply this interpretation in later cases that will come to it. That's the importance. And in these advisory opinions, I would say the court make a major contribution for the protection of the environment, because it recognized that the environment, the protection of the environment and the right to healthy environment is interdependent and is indivisible from the protection of all other human rights, because human rights cannot be enjoyed without having a healthy environment. And the protection of the environment cannot be realized without protecting the other human rights. So they see that there's a full interaction and interconnection between environment and human rights. The Inter-American system has I will say, a better position regarding the protection of the environment if you compare, for example, with the European system. Why? Because we have one article that is a legal source for the protection of the right to a healthy environment, that is Article 11 from the additional protocol to the American Convention of Human Rights, Protocol of San Salvador, which specifically and expressly recognized the right to healthy environment. And therefore, there is an obligation of all states, member of the system, to protect the environment and to provide to everybody, every individual within the jurisdictions, access to that specific right. So in that sense, the court interpreted that this is an autonomous right that has content in itself regarding the other elements shared with other human rights. It has a collective dimension that is important not only for the current generations, but also future generations. And in this sense, is very linked with the way that indigenous people's rights are interpreted, because they are interpreting the benefit not of only of the current generation, but as well on future and past generations. And it has an individual dimension, because individuals' rights like health, life, personal integrity cannot be fully enjoyed without a healthy environment. So in that sense, the degradation of the environment will affect all other rights. And that's why the court paid specific attention to how this right should be protected, and in particular in the context of those in situation of more vulnerable positions. And that is where the connection with indigenous peoples come from. I just show you, for example, an additional case developed by the court after the adoption of the advisory opinion. That is the case of La Cajunta Association versus Argentina, so the 2020, where the court applied the jurisprudence developed in the advisory opinion in a concrete case, and recognized that the right of a healthy environment constitutes a universal value and is a fundamental right for the existence of humankind, and is an autonomous right. So as you can see, this from a sort of soft law interpretation made in an advisory opinion, the right has been incorporated within the hard law, if you want, jurisprudence of the court in a contagious jurisdiction in a case against Argentina. What is interesting in connection with the construction of this right is that the court pay attention to both aspects, the substantive aspect of the healthy environment and the procedural aspect. And these two aspects later on will become in additional safeguard for the protection of the right of indigenous people. Because for the substantive aspect, well, it stresses the linkage with right to life in particular, but also health and personal integrity. But I will further develop into the connection with the right to property, because a key right for indigenous peoples is the right to communal property. And communal property over traditional lands is intimately connected with the possibility of indigenous peoples to develop and maintain their cultural distinctiveness that is connected with their own environment, with their own natural resources, the resources that they traditionally use. And therefore, the environmental component of the right to property over those traditional lands becomes really essential for the protection of that right. But as well, there are certain procedural rights connected with the right of healthy environment. And here you have to think on information, participation, benefit sharing, etc. We'll come back to that. Let's move forward. Key understanding of the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court is the interconnection of indigenous peoples' traditional lands and the cultural and physical survival of indigenous people. By identifying that relevance that traditional lands have on indigenous people's life, the court has recognized that right to property also include the way that indigenous peoples address communal property. So communal property over traditional lands is part of the right to property protected by the American Convention. Not because the text of the convention says so, but because the court has developed an evolutionary interpretation of the convention that leads toward that recognition, and based on the ILO convention and other instruments. Because for the court, without protecting that collective aspect of traditional property or the right to property over traditional lands, indigenous peoples will not be able to enjoy across the region the same rights than other individuals. And they will be deprived of the protection of the convention if the court will not recognize that collective property right. But my research question is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the introduction of this paper, is how the recognition of the right to healthy environment has enhanced the protection of indigenous people's land rights. And here I will try to provide an answer by interpreting the components of the right to property. So a key issue to understand why the right to communal property is protected is because without that protection, cultural identity and survival of indigenous people will suffer. They need to have access to the traditional lands in order to be able to develop their own identity according to their traditional, their traditions and costumes. And that is intimately connected with the cultural survival and with their physical survival. But cultural identity is also part of right to life. Right to life in the jurisprudence of the court has two components, stricto sensu and lato sensu. The stricto sensu is the not deprivation of the right, but the lato sensu is to be able to enjoy the conditions for the development of the project of life. Well, if cultural identity suffers, right to life will suffer because you will not be able to live the life that you would like to live. And in the case of indigenous people, that is intimately connected with their lands and therefore with a healthy environment. And here is the connection that we would like to build, because the court, in order to protect that relation with the lands, has identified, this is very generic, there is a lot of jurisprudence on this, but I will try to summarize because I only have 3 minutes more to go. And I see Emmanuel looking at the watch. So we have three kinds of safeguards. One is effective participation, which is a procedural safeguard. So everything regarding to indigenous people's traditional lands needs to be consulted with them. And in certain cases, even their free, pure, and informed consent should be sought by the state when there is the case of large-scale development projects that will affect their relationship with their lands. Benefit need to be shared. And before any project will be considered by the state, it should be developed or perform a pure environmental and social impact assessment, how those projects will affect the access and enjoyment of indigenous people over their own lands. And these safeguards, according to the core, has been identified in order to protect, in particular, that special relationship with the lands. But then we have the safeguard identified in connection with the protection of the environment. And there are, in general terms, 3 of them. One is the obligation of prevention. So states need to prevent any potential damage on the environment. The respect of the precautionary principle, even in case of inexistence of scientific concrete evidence. But if the damage is possible, states should avoid to engage in activities that could generate damage, and the duty to cooperate, in the case of indigenous people, will be with indigenous people's traditional leaders. So these safeguards are put in place in order to prevent irreversible damage to the environment, which, as I mentioned before, is essential for indigenous people's enjoyment of their own right. So these substantive safeguards are also tied with procedural safeguards that are very similar to the ones recognized in the case of indigenous people's jurisprudence. Access to information, participation in decision-making, access to justice, very, very similar. So how this could be combined, and with this I will try to end this presentation. I think what is the contribution of these additional safeguards recognized in the jurisprudence of environmental protection by the court has made that the environmental impact assessment that should be done is stronger in the case of the indigenous people, because it should take into consideration the vulnerable position of indigenous people, because their absolute need of having access to those lands for their survival. But also those environmental assessments should consider the social aspect of the effect of potential project over indigenous people's lands. The social aspect and the human rights aspect, which will be the social and human rights effects that those projects will generate in the future for indigenous people present in those territories where an exploitation or exploration of natural resources will take place. Participation and consultation also include the right to inform environmental matters, which is something new that before was not that clear, that present in the jurisprudence of the court. So after the recognition of the right of healthy environment, when states would like to engage in any development project on indigenous people's traditional territories or lands, they need to provide information in a manner that indigenous people will be able to understand and reflect on, in connection with the environmental impacts, in connection with the environmental causes and effects of that specific project. And that is very specific, and it should be present in the participation and consultation process that need to take place. So at the very end, in order to make a sum up of this presentation, and this is my research conclusion, that I will say after interpreting the jurisprudence of the indigenous people rights and the environmental protection developed by the court, what is key on connection with indigenous people is the special relationship with traditional lands. Which have a spiritual and material element that is intimately connected with their cultural identity, which is part of their right to life and their right to live in dignity. That's mean in accordance with their own traditions. States have the obligation to introduce positive actions for the protection of that relationship that will create the conditions for indigenous people to live their own project of life according to their own traditions. Part of those positive actions is the recognition of the right to collective property, but also the protection of the environment over those specific lands that will enable the right to life to flourish in a safe and healthy environment. So in this sense, environmental safeguards will reinforce the protection of life in dignity and cultural identity of indigenous peoples over their own traditional lands. I will stop here. I will stop sharing. I think I'm within my time. This has been a little bit of a rush, but I will stay with you for your questions in case that you would like to further discuss this topic. Thank you very much for your attention, and let's keep the discussion alive. Emmanuel.
Thank you so much, Alejandro, for that very, very insightful presentation on your research outcomes. I have a lot of questions just on the process and also what has been going on since the advisory opinion came out. Of course, since then, I think we've seen developments like the Escazú Agreement and all of these other progress in the area of protection, but also we see how tangible these challenges are, for instance, in places like Nicaragua, where indigenous peoples have been suffering for decades, in particular in these recent years from colonizing and the expansion of agricultural frontiers and just basically transgressions into their rights in their lands and historical and ancestral territories. So thank you so much for that presentation. We'll come back with questions and we'll be able to dig a little deeper into your work. For now, let's turn it over to Hector and Juliana, who will be talking to us about the nature as victim in the Colombian armed conflict, the case of attacks against oil infrastructure. So with that, Hector, Juliana, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Well, super briefly, because we had a lot to say and only 10 minutes. Currently, there is a window of opportunity in Colombia to advance in the recognition of the rights of nature under armed conflicts situations. And this is because two historical and legal trends are happening now, and they intersect currently in Colombia. The first trend, historical legal trend, is the recognition of nature as a subject of rights in the Colombian jurisprudence, with cases like the Atrato River, or also with the case of the Amazon forest and other rivers as well, and other ecosystems had been recognized as subject of rights in the Colombian jurisprudence, constitutional law, Supreme Court of Justice, etc. And the second historical and legal trend happening right now is the transitional justice that we have now open in Colombia because of the peace agreement with La Guerrilla, the guerrilla group Las FARC-EP. So this is the second historical legal trend, and they intersect right now in Colombia currently. So with Juliana, we argue, our argument is that in an article that to be published this year in a book edited by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, we argue that an analysis from the ecocentric approach for the recognition of nature as a victim of the armed conflict within the framework of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And to do so, we use as case study the attacks against the Trasandino pipeline, which is in Putumayo and Nariño, like next to the border with Ecuador in the southwest of Colombia, in a geographical jurisdiction prioritized in the macro case 02 of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And the Transandean oil pipeline is as I said, is located in this area in the north of Putumayo and the south of Nariño, and it starts in the Amazon forest. And it goes all through the Andean mountains, Andean forests, high altitude wetlands, páramos, and then goes to the Gulf, el Golfo de Tumaco, la Bahía de Tumaco, the Bay of Tumaco, in the Pacific Ocean. And it also goes through several very relevant and strategic ecosystems like the Amazon and the Andean mountains. And this pipeline, the Transandean pipeline, has been particularly affected by the action of illegal armed groups. Just very briefly, like in the period of 1986 to 2015, there are documented 448 armed actions against this pipeline, including 279 attacks with explosives. And one particular case shows like the dimension of the attacks. In June 22 of 2015, an attack was perpetrated by the Daniel Aldana units of La Guerrilla de las FARC EP with heavy social and environmental impacts. Just to name like one of the impacts, like more than 100,000 people didn't stop having access to water, to drinking water because of this attack, because of the pollution generated with the attack. But it also affected, for example, just to name one species like the piangua, which is a type of mollusk, which also communities depend on as a source of food and also as a source of revenue, because they also like trade and sell this mollusk. Just to name a couple of examples to explain the case. So, Juliana.
Thank you, Hector. So the examination of the attacks against the Transandine oil pipeline led us to propose the ecocentric approach as a contribution to the legal analysis of the crimes against nature in the Colombian armed conflict, particularly within the framework of the special jurisdiction for peace. Due to time, we are not going to explain the specific case, but I will share the main arguments and conclusions of our research. First, the ecocentric approach can facilitate the identification and a combined analysis of the effects for the communities on the socioeconomic and cultural level, as well as the damage caused to environment, non-human entities, and ecosystems, taking into account the intrinsic relationships between all the biosphere elements that it's part of the main arguments of the ecocentric approach. Second, we consider that an ecocentric approach allows to demonstrate the reasons and motivations behind the crimes committed against nature, moving away from notions based on property, that it's the main focus in the national and international law, towards a conception based on the interrelationship between the components of the biosphere. In these terms, ecocentrism will lead to examine not only the economic or military reasons behind crimes against nature, but also to investigate the understanding of the armed actors about the relationship among communities, environment, species, and ecosystems. And so, if the commission of the acts against the nature so directly or indirectly to distort, disintegrate, or annul those relationships between the biosphere elements. Thus, the ecocentric approach will open the possibility of examining whether if the damage of nature was part of the practices and modes of criminal action of the legal and illegal armed groups, and will permit expanding the exercise of revealing the motivations behind the attacks against nature and its effects. Third, the ecocentric perspective can contribute to the understanding of individual criminal responsibility. And for us, this is a main point of our research, because there is a lot of research related to the nature of subject of rights, but there are no many research about the responsibility, the individual responsibility and criminal responsibility for these kind of attacks. So according to the ecocentric approach, as humans, we are the only components of nature with the intellectual consensus and the ability to influence in nature. And that's why we have a role of custodians with obligations to preserve and protect nature, right? Thus, this perspective helps us to contextualize the actions and responsibilities of armed groups in the internal armed conflict, that it's the specific context that we are looking at. However, we find out a critical point regarding the legal assessment of these behaviors in national and international criminal law that fail to comprehend the protection of nature from an ecocentric approach, because they are mainly based on an anthropocentric approach. For the perspective, for the specific Colombian transitional justice context, And this particular case of the attacks against the pipeline, we identify some possible legal avenues in the customary international humanitarian law as a possible legal framework for the determination of individual criminal responsibility based on the due diligence obligations that armed actors must observe to avoid or minimize the effects of war actions against nature. And yet, we believe that the classification of a criminal conduct against nature requires a very innovative legal strategies that include key elements of national law and international law. In conclusion, the adoption of the ecocentric approach allows to demonstrate the reasons, motivations, and responsibilities behind the crimes committed against nature in the internal armed conflict, and reinforce our thesis in favor of its reconnection as a victim, specifically in the special jurisdiction for peace. We consider that this is an innovative multidisciplinary perspective, not only for the special jurisdiction for peace, but also for the transitional justice tribunals and the criminal courts that investigate and prosecute crimes against nature. Just for some final remarks, we like to share some recommendations that we did to the special jurisdiction for peace for the adoption of this ecocentric approach, but mainly is the importance of the multidisciplinary research for the evaluation of the impacts on the environment and the non-human entities, the participation of victims and communities in the identification and assessment of the damages and impacts. And this is very important because of the relationship between the communities and nature, but also the relationship is very important and must to be considered for the accreditation and the judicial representation of the nature in some legal procedures. Gather information related to the causes and motivations of crimes against nature. It's important in the voluntary sessions, prior pedagogy with those giving a declaration on the subject, the FARC or the state forces that participate in this case in these cases. As I say, the importance of a classification of the criminal conduct against nature requires an innovative legal strategy that includes elements of national and international criminal law, human rights, and customary international criminal law. And it's important that the scheme of sanctions that will be imposed to these actors that committed these crimes includes actions of restoration, preservation, and conservation of nature for trying to repair the damage that they caused the communities and the nature. I will finish there. Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments.
Hector and Juliana, thank you very much. It was a fascinating topic, and in particular, just because I have some cursory knowledge of the armed conflict in Colombia, and of course the current historical context provides for that creativity in rethinking the way that transitional justice is usually and historically has been dealt, to include these ecological crimes that are definitely one of the heaviest tolls also in communities that have been negatively impacted and for decades by these crimes. And we'll have plenty of questions to go back to. I'm also curious to see what potential interplay there could be for the inter-American human rights system, and also supporting that kind of new thinking and promoting this ecocentric approach, and how fast we could potentially move to a moment where we can have criminal proceedings to find and to assign responsibility and criminal liability for these crimes. So with that, we'll hand it over to Mariana. We'll stay in the neighborhood, just because we understand that the work that she does is focusing on understanding and identifying the good practices in supporting environmental human rights defenders, which, as we know, are at the front lines of these situations, not only in active armed conflicts. Like we know in Colombia, there are regions that are very much still in conflict, even though there is a peace agreement. The FARC dissidents and the ELN and other residual armed groups are still pretty much disputing the territories that were abandoned by the demobilized FARC units, but also we see that there are, not just in countries like Colombia, but elsewhere in Latin America and around the world, global human rights and environmental defenders are disproportionately targeted. If I'm not mistaken, Colombia was one of the deadliest places to be an environmental human rights defender. So very, very keen on hearing about your research, Mariana, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. And thank you to the organizers. And it's great to be here with such wonderful speakers and very interesting topics. As you pointed out, unfortunately, and almost every year since 2008, the world has seen a tragic new record, and it's a spike in the killings and attacks against individuals that, working alone or as part of a community, try to protect the environment and the human rights that depend upon it, as the previous speakers have already pointed. I'm not going to go into detail on the interconnections between the environment and human rights. But basically, an environmental defender is any individual or group. It can be an organization, a movement, a network, or a community, including communities of indigenous peoples, that work to protect the environment or the rights that depend upon it from multiple causes. And the killings that we've known and that we hear about every day in the news are just the tip of the iceberg. As you all know, behind every killing, there are a range of other human rights violations, including physical and sexual assault, criminalizations, enforced disappearance, forced displacement, among many more. And increasingly, environmental defenders are also being silenced through non-violent repressive means, and that includes obstructive laws and obstructive frameworks, biased judiciary systems, surveillance, expulsion from participatory spaces, among many more. And that's not only at the national and local level, but also and increasingly at an international level as well. And the causes for that shrinking civic space for environmental defenders are multiple, and there are historical patterns of exclusion and discrimination, as well as of violence, the unsustainable, of course, exploitation of natural resources, and as my colleagues have pointed out, even violent conflicts that in turn have many other root and complex causes. But a shared trait that we've seen is that most environmental defenders end up facing the risk they face because they tend to speak up and oppose powerful economic and political interests, whether these are legitimate or not. And also against well-entrenched and mainstream beliefs and ways of life. So in response to this crisis, and I'm going to share my screen now, and against this backdrop, the United Nations and a number of states, development agencies, civil society actors, and that includes, of course, civil society organizations, but also academics, the media, and many more have put in place a wide range of strategies to support environmental defenders. And without these supportive strategies, environmental defenders would be considerably more vulnerable to attacks. So throughout the past 7 years, we have been working with defenders and experts to understand how can different actors contribute to addressing and ideally overcoming the dire situation faced by environmental defenders. And one of the things that we've seen is that most environmental defenders value and need different forms of support. And broadly, support means different types of assistance to access resources that can be tangible or intangible, like information and even skills, to be able to protect the environment while being able to also secure their well-being in terms of security, integrity, but also mental health and adequate standards of living. And also to be able to demand states to fulfill their human rights obligations, including the right to a clean, healthy, safe, and sustainable environment. So one form of addressing this crisis is to understand what has worked in terms of support to environmental defenders and to disseminate that information and that understanding, ideally to encourage the replication and implementation of further initiatives. Increased information about what has worked would not only help to build solidarity about environmental defenders, bringing on board different actors that are not yet supporting these defenders, but would further contribute to empowering defenders by informing them about the various mechanisms and strategies that exist and are available for them to achieve their ends. Plus, at the same time, would contribute to informing and educating the public on what works, and ultimately to create a safe and enabling environment for the protection of the environment. So with that in mind, the Universal Rights Group and the United Nations Environment Program, with the support of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the current and former Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Professors David Boyd and Jen Knox, developed a project to identify good practices to support and to understand what has worked. I'm not going to go into the methodology, and I've shared already some of the objectives with you, but the key, due to time, but the key point of this project, it was that it was developed with a direct input of environmental defenders from across the world, organizations working to support them, and experts also working to support them in different contexts, settings, and countries. And I'm going to start also due to time with our key conclusions or the key observations of what we've seen, rather than going into detail, because there's a lot to unpack, of course, from this project. And the first key takeaways, or the key lessons that we think that might guide the future action to support environmental defenders, is that, first of all, the broad term support encompasses a wide range of activities with varied purposes. But as I said, they all share the common objective or the overarching purpose of supporting the permanence and effectiveness of the environmental defenders' work, as well as the well-being understood in a broad sense, including not only the physical well-being, but also the individual, or, as Alejandro pointed out earlier, collective well-being when it's appropriate. And a very important aspect of that is that there's no one-size-fits-all formula for support. The risk and the challenges faced by environmental defenders are, of course, influenced by their particular social, economic, political, and cultural context, and the overlapping identities and experiences of each defender or community also play an important role in the way in which the different threats and obstacles materialize and ultimately affect the persons or communities. And accordingly, of course, the most appropriate way to help defenders response to those situations depends on the particular setting of each individual or group. So, for example, supporting an indigenous woman who is an environmental defender is completely different strategy to the ones deployed to support her female counterparts in an urban setting. And that's quite obvious when you say that loud, but in practice it has not been very obvious at the time that particularly some states have implemented support and protection strategies. The second one is that support goes beyond providing support to defenders in settings of violence. And responding to violence is, of course, a key priority. And violence is perhaps the most pressing threat and priority across the world. But while physical violence is perhaps the most visible and concerning threat, it is not the only one. In all countries, environmental defenders face multiple other obstacles and threats, including non-physical forms of violence, like hate speech, non-violence means to silence their work, like the restrictive laws that we've talked about, and even obstacles such as exclusion, isolation, among many others. Thus, when we think about supporting environmental defenders, we have to think more broadly, going beyond context of violence and understanding that defenders that are not yet in a position or in a situation of violence that represents an imminent risk to themselves also require and also need different types of assistance. And support, that's also another important point, is not only provided by external actors, so something that the United Nations or the human rights institutions or civil society organizations give to a defender in need. Support comes from various sources, normally sources that should coordinate efforts between themselves. And an important part of support, source of support, are environmental defenders and their communities themselves. So peer learning and peer capacity building are, for example, for most defenders, including in my own country, the most valuable source of support. That doesn't mean, of course, that external support is much needed, as is the case of funding. But it is important to keep in mind that. And finally, and related to what I've said, is that strategies to support defenders are seldomly rely on only one kind of activity. So capacity building efforts normally have to be accompanied by funding, accompanied by collaboration, by information sharing, among many other activities. And these observations that I've shared have practical implications when it comes to the design and implementation of support strategies. First one is the need for coordination between different actors, as I've said before, in order to address the multiple and intersecting threats and obstacles that affect defenders. And something that has to be kept in mind always is intersectionality. Intersectionality plays a key role, not only in the threats and risks faced, but therefore in the specific forms of support and the specific strategies that are needed to overcome those threats. And of course, something else that has, that's another important practical implication, and is the common perception that environmental defenders are victims that need to be saved, has to be overcome, and has to be replaced with a more active perception of their role. So understanding and engaging with defenders as key agents, as the individuals that are most aware and have the best understanding of their particular context and of their needs, it's key. And that implies that on the day-to-day, rather than vertical relationships, we should be building horizontal relationships between defenders and supporters that are able to empower really defenders, so they are able to forge their own futures. And that, of course, also means, and something very, very important, is that learning from a specific successful supportive strategy is essential to draw key lessons, but it doesn't mean that it can be replicated in exactly the same way in other situations, even if the situation is the same country. So from community to community, the activities have to be, of course, adapted to each situation. And broadly and generally, there are three key objectives. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to pass through these very fast. And there are three core intertwined objectives that should be addressed at the moment of offering support. And of course, there are plenty of good practices that may fall in one or other objective, and it doesn't mean that all support strategies need to address the three objectives, because that's quite impossible, particularly knowing that each actor has limited resources. But it's important to keep in mind that each strategy should at least coordinate action or coordinate efforts, even if indirectly or explicitly with unexplicitly with other. The first one is creating strong institutions for the protection and the defense of the environment and the human rights that depend upon it. And that means what in other settings has been called its primary prevention. And it's building in strong human rights and environmental protection frameworks and rule of law systems that will ultimately contribute to addressing root causes and preventing attacks against environmental defenders from happening in the first place. A second important set is addressing situations that may negatively affect human rights, so specific threats and vulnerabilities that are affecting each situation. So while the first efforts are to the benefits of the population in general, these go to the benefit of particular environmental defenders. But addressing situations should have a strong focus on secondary prevention. So when we are aware of the risk and the threats, and we want to act early to prevent them from materializing. And of course, when these do not, and sadly, under the perception of many defenders who participated in this project, has been the approach is not preventive, but rather reactive. So when the risks and threats are evident and they're materialized in different aspects, a key aspect, a key strategy or a key good practice is to approach truth's holistic security. And that means supporting, of course, physical, digital, and psychosocial well-being, but that includes not only the individual or the collective part, but also addressing the economic part, the political part, and the angle of those. Finally, of course, when everything fails, and this is sadly the case that we mostly see, is cases of emergency. And in cases of emergency, the key aspect of good practices to respond successfully to emergency cases is flexibility and promptness. Not promptness from the perspective of those supporting, because many organizations say like, oh, we disburse the funds very fast, 3 days. Yeah, but there were just someone in imminent risk of being killed, 3 days is a lot. So really flexibility and trying to match the speeds of those on the ground is key. And the third angle is accessing, helping defenders access justice, seeking non-repetition and reparation, and basically seeking accountability for what has happened. And that has, again, different angles. The first one is working with states, because a key part of that is securing objective, transparent, and timely investigations, but also working with defenders on the side to overcome access to justice barriers through legal assistance, through information sharing, among many others. So I'm going to stop here. I know that I ran out of time, and I apologize about that. There's a lot to unpack, and the results of our project will be shared by a report on our website that will be available to all. So I look forward to discussing with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, for that very comprehensive just outlook on everything that you have been working in the specific situation of environmental human rights defenders. We know Colombia is an incredibly complex political security context for these human rights defenders to do their work. And we'll definitely come back, as I have questions about the narrative and the visibility, and how in these waves of killings that we've seen in Colombia, the attacks against social leaders that are kind of seen as like this catch-all category, we see that in there you have these environmental human rights defenders that are usually very hyper-local leaders that are not necessarily accessed in, or featured in the news media or in the outlets that are diffused in the urban settings in Bogota and the big cities, Medellin. So this is the very real question of the urban-rural divide, and that fracture that makes two realities almost coexisting in the same territory is a fascinating question. And I think one of the biggest challenges to overcome this kind of situation of defenselessness. So with that, we'll come back. We have enough to go around, and we're going to go to Tobias Bowman, who will share with us his findings on an entirely different angle, but it's about the potential for UN peacekeeping operations to promote environmental quality. And we all know that, since the development of the multidimensional style of missions that the United Nations has deployed in places like Haiti, in the Congo, and the Central African Republic, these very large presence of blue helmets in these countries can have a real impact in their ecosystem. Some people, of course, will think about Haiti and the arrival of cholera into the country, but also there's potential silver linings, and they think that's where this conversation will take us now. So with that, Tobias, the screen is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks so much for the organizers for having me here. I hope you can see the presentation now. So I'm sharing the screen, and then hopefully you have access to this as well. The title of the presentation is "Can UN Peacekeeping Promote Environmental Quality?" And as you may have guessed from the introduction, it's a kind of broader approach that doesn't really focus on a single case, this research project as such, but basically across a number of conflicts where UN peacekeeping troops have intervened. We're trying to figure out whether there is some kind of, you could say, somewhat unknown externality that has to do with better environmental quality. So starting point for this is then the following. So basically since the 1940s, we've seen more than 70 United Nations peacekeeping operations. And here, when referring to PKOs, I'm meaning the kind of traditional sort of intervention that you might have in mind. So there's a conflict going on, a post-conflict peace emerges. And in this post-conflict peace, there's a number of nations that basically sends a peacekeeping contingent there. And these peacekeepers then have the main goal of restoring and maintaining that peace and security. So largely in a kind of more passive way, frequently also unarmed, that if they're armed, then they use only weapons for self-defense. But this is a kind of scenario that we all have in mind when talking about peacekeeping operations. And this is a kind of scenario that we also focus on. When concentrating on this main goal of restoring and maintaining international peace and security, there is an abundant number of works out there that essentially shows strongly and robustly that peacekeeping does work. So if you want to keep peace, if you want to do something for stability in a post-conflict environment, well, then one of the best things that you can do is indeed send peacekeeping troops there, because they are effective to the extent that they can indeed restore and maintain international peace and security. We kind of depart from this traditional scenario a little bit, because what we have seen, especially since the end of the Cold War, so around 1990, 1991, is that peacekeeping has massively evolved. And contemporary missions now are way more complex than they used to be. They are multidimensional. So even though they still have peace and security as the main goal, they also try to address other aspects pertaining to stability, pertaining to development on the ground. And the overarching term there is no longer than peacekeeping as such, even though we still call them peacekeeping missions, but essentially peace building. So way more complex, way more far-reaching mandates, and they encompass a series of non-military elements, which may pertain to, for instance, election monitoring, which may pertain to economic development. And these non-military elements that kind of then move beyond simply peace and stability, they give rise to other less obvious implications and consequences of peacekeepers, which research recently and increasingly tries to address as well. So what others have found is that peacekeepers might have an impact on crime in countries on the ground. They might have an impact on economic development, even so no element in the mandate basically speaks about primarily economic development or promoting this. But these implications frequently do exist, and for most of the time they are actually normatively positive, to the extent that peacekeepers, for instance, do indeed promote economic development on the ground. So we contribute to this research here as my co-author and I examine another previously largely unknown implication of PKOs, which is improved environmental quality. General definition here for environmental quality can be, and I mean, most of you guys know this anyway, because this is a main focus of your work as well. Environmental quality, broadly defined, is a measure of the condition of an environment relative to the requirements of one or more species and or to any human need or purpose. When coming to the empirics in a bit, then you will see that we examined different specifications and operationalizations, but eventually settled on water quality. This is evidently one of the areas that PKOs most likely can directly affect when being on the ground. But we kind of operate in this context of saying that, okay, peacekeeping troops, yes, they move into a specific post-conflict environment. The main purpose of these has not changed since the establishment in the 1940s, because it is still the promotion of peace and security, and certainly not the promotion of environmental outcomes primarily, but nonetheless, there might be this positive externality linked to PKO involvement, which is environmental quality as such. There's a lot of qualitative evidence out there such as this one here. So Indonesian peacekeepers in African countries basically planting trees, doing something for biodiversity and vegetation. There is all sorts of other evidence where peacekeepers basically try to improve the water infrastructure, water quality on the ground. And against the background of this more qualitative case-specific evidence, we thought, okay, what are the more general arguments for why we might see some kind of effect of peacekeeping operations on environmental quality, and is there any kind of evidence? The theoretical argument then for this is based on a threefold approach. So why would we essentially see some kind of effect? And the first reason for why we might observe a link, the positive link between PKOs and environmental quality, is that many UN peacekeeping mission mandates now refer to activities that directly address environmental concerns and can promote its quality in the host country. So most mandates now, particularly since the early 2000s, they directly focus on the provision of agricultural land. They provide or concentrate on the building of water-related infrastructure. They mention the reduction of illegal resource extraction. And to give you a specific example from the MINUSMA mandate, so the mission in Mali, this comprises an environmental action plan to observe the management of solid and dangerous waste, energy, water, wastewater, flora, fauna, as well as the protection of historical and cultural sites. So according to this mechanism here, when subscribing to some kind of real influence of this language in the mandates and subscribing to the assumption that peacekeepers try to implement on the ground what is basically stated in the mandate, there should be a positive effect of peacekeeping operations on environmental quality. The second mechanism has to do with the increasing cooperation among UN bodies, such as, and primarily, the United Nations Environmental Program, because these guys have also been stressing increasingly the need to put the environment at the center of preventing and resolving conflicts. So in a nutshell here, what you got for this second mechanism is that you got a second set of organizations within the UN family that do not have primarily a focus on peace and security promotion, but nonetheless establish now this connection, which peacekeepers then are responsible for, the peacekeeping department. And through this cooperation, through these increasingly established networks, PKOs can essentially make use of the expertise that these other organizations have, which then focus on environmental activities. So UNEP and its partners state, for example, that they support African countries through addressing the environment as part of a peacemaking and peacekeeping process. Environmental Peacebuilding Association, another organization, develops, manages, and shares knowledge on environmental conflict and peace, acknowledging the importance of environmental quality to promote sustainable peace. A last mechanism for why we might observe a positive effect has to do with the general kind of position of the United Nations towards the environment. And there are essentially two main policies that have been introduced over the recent past. In 2004, you got the environmental policy for UN field missions. In 2018, you got the Declaration of Shared Commitments on UN peacekeeping operations. And these general UN-wide policies essentially try to make peacekeeping missions greener. So they focus on when peacekeepers go to a specific conflict country or post-conflict state, arrive there on the ground, how can they make the impact of these peacekeeping troops on the environment as little as possible, as less intrusive as possible. So these policies then focus essentially then on the peacekeeping missions as such, reducing waste there, having as little impact on the environment on the ground as such. But if peacekeepers essentially try to adhere and abide by these general policies, we should not only observe that peacekeeping mission as such become greener, but there might also be then an effect beyond interventions for the host country as such. So this kind of environmental quality aspect that we focus on. So much for the theory. In a nutshell then, when subscribing to the validity of these three mechanisms, we should observe that peacekeeping troops do indeed have a positive impact on environmental quality. The question is there any kind of empirical evidence for this? And we approach this question in a quantitative way. So we compiled data on peacekeeping operations and environmental quality. And essentially due to data availability in the end, this data set that we compiled comprises 17 African countries in the time period from 1995 to 2012. We focus on civil war countries, so this allows that peacekeeping was at least a possibility. So if there was no conflict whatsoever, Namibia, for instance, over the more recent past, then there is no chance that any kind of peacekeeping troops intervene to begin with. So these countries are excluded from the analysis. It is a focus on African countries, so keep in mind other states and other regions are not included in analysis. This is kind of driven by data availability. But also from a practical point of view, it ensures that we essentially analyze a set of countries that to a large degree are rather similar in several aspects at the macro level, which may then influence both environmental quality and the intervention of peacekeeping troops as such. So in this quantitative setup, the outcome variable that we examine, the kind of proxy for environmental quality, is in water quality progress. And here we focus on the DALI rate, which is essentially the number of age standardized disability adjusted life years lost per 100,000 inhabitants due to unsafe water resources and sanitations. So this variable has a bunch of advantages over other operationalizations. Primarily, or the most important one, is that PKOs can directly influence this. So it's not something completely abstract, absurd, and distant from what peacekeeping troops do. And in fact, in quite a few mandates of the more recent past, this is directly included in what peacekeepers should be doing on the ground. Plus, at the same time, water pollution is a core component of any understanding of environmental quality. What we do with this variable is that we invert it so that higher values of this variable essentially pertain to better progress or better environmental quality. And we focus on changes in this progress over a year. Some technical stuff. So we use panel corrected standard errors with fixed effective countries and region years. And we also consider, in additional analysis, dependent variables that differ from this water quality variable, namely ecological footprint, emissions, deforestation, and carbon efficiency. I'm not going to talk about these additional robustness checks in the presentation here, but the results that we get with these different operationalizations is basically, or are basically the same as the ones that I'm going to show you in a second. Main explanatory variable is then UN peacekeeping troops, and we employ binary variables, so whether peacekeeping basically took place or not, 1, 0, and a count variable, which measures how many peacekeeping troops have been on the ground. In about 31% of all country years, we saw UN peace missions. We also used a matching technique in order to address this self-selection of peacekeeping troops, because the assignment of peacekeeping is quite unlikely a random process to begin with. And the United Nations or contributing countries select specific interventions in a quite strategic way. So this matching process and approach controls for this. Plus, we include a series of standard control variables pertaining to peacekeeping and environmental quality. What do we get in terms of the findings, in terms of the effects? So you see here essentially two graphs pertaining to two model estimations, and they capture the simulated effects. So we basically estimated what is the effect of sending peacekeeping troops to a country on environmental quality, on the water quality progress there on the ground for either this binary variable, sending peacekeeping troops, yes or no, or on the right-hand side, the number of peacekeeping personnel, yeah? And what you see here is essentially then this distribution of the variable of the simulation. We mark the 0 effect with a dashed line, and the solid line captures the mean effect, which is on the left-hand side around 0.02, and on the right-hand side, it's closer to 0.005. What do these numbers essentially mean in a substantive fashion? Well, they do mean that we find quite strong and robust support for our theoretical expectation, namely the coefficient estimate of 0.023 in the first model translates into an improvement of about 1 life year per 100,000 persons for any UN mission intervening. So you send peacekeeping troops on the ground, and our model suggests that you basically save 1 life year per 100,000 persons through improvement of water structure, water infrastructure, and water quality overall. The fact is pretty similar when looking at the overall troop size. So this is what you got for model 2 and the second bullet point here. And out of the 1,000 simulations that we have, or for the previous graph, we see that only a small share of about 2.3% is linked to a coefficient estimate of smaller than or equal to 0. And it's roughly the same for the peacekeeping troop model that we had on the right-hand side on the previous slide. So long story short, yes, in this quantitative analysis of 17 African countries over a time period since the 1990s, we do find strong and robust support that peacekeeping troops are linked to better environmental quality on the ground as captured by better water quality. But keep in mind that I said already that we also considered alternative proxies pertaining to emissions, ecological footprint, deforestation, and carbon efficiency. Last slide then, so peacekeeping does keep peace. We do not question this, and this focus, which has been established in the 1940s, still remains today, and it is valid. And again, there is ample research out there that suggests and points to strong evidence that this is indeed the case. But we should not forget that there are also less obvious implications and side effects, and we focus essentially on environmental quality there. Side effects and less obvious implications are essentially those that are not necessarily directly specified in mandates or are not the primary goal of peacekeeping missions, but nonetheless, peacekeepers might influence these things simply by their presence on the ground or by trying to implement the mandate they have. Theoretically, we've developed the argument that PKOs enhance the environmental quality in host countries via 3 avenues. And in the quantitative data analysis on, well, African countries between 1995 and 2012, we have found strong and robust support for this. And at this point, I'm going to end the presentation. Thank you very much for the attention, and I'm looking forward to any comments or questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Tobias. I think we are all very curious to hear more about the potential other next steps that this research may take, and how it can also spark new avenues for understanding better the footprint and the potential for peacekeepers to be even more active in this sort of preservation of environmental quality in the places where they are deployed. So we are running out of time, and I just want to be mindful of that. I know we have one question in the chat, and also I think we might want to group some of these just so I can address so many of the points that you have all raised in your specific presentation. So let me just start. And Alejandro, Hector, and Juliana, this may be somewhere where you can have a bit of a dialogue, and we can keep our comments and reactions brief. We can potentially have a conversation here. But so for one, Alejandro, in your research and what you found so far about the advisory opinions of the court since 2017 and up until now, what do you think are the trends? You will continue to see more cases be brought to the court, and in the case of the Escazú agreement, how do you see it changing potentially the way in which the states have to assume responsibilities for the cases brought to the Inter-American court system? And with that, I also want to ask a question to Hector and Juliana. You've brought this amazing ecocentrism as an approach to the Colombian transitional justice context. And my question there is, do you see any positive signs or pressures coming from the Inter-American human rights system into moving the needle in the justice case in Colombia so that it is further recognized and some of these crimes actually may be ultimately included as part of the transitional process? For Mariana, I would, just a very specific question, because we work at USIP in tracking the situation of social leaders, and we know it's a very difficult context for them to operate, and the levels of threats that they face are very, diverse depending on the regions where they are. The further out, further away from the urban areas, the more dangerous in general, but also we've seen situations in urban settings that are quite worrisome. So you've brought the points, the good practices, and we really appreciate that, because, that's the work to know the best ways to support them. I'm curious about the issue of visibility of their campaigns and their connections across the country, because we know it's a vast country. So Colombia has realities that are similar in some ways, but also dramatically different. And you've brought intersectionality to the fore, which is really the key here. So is there such an effort in Colombian civil society to help create bridges and networks that span across these different communities, you know, from Antioquia to Putumayo to Valle del Cauca, or are these just very hyper-localized dynamics in each community? And that's why the defense of these human rights activists is so difficult, because they are not necessarily, you know, cerrando los codos, or, you know, making sure that they're able to stand together. And then last but not least, for Tobias, you know, the research program on the footprint of the environmental footprint of peacekeepers, I'm sorry, is not necessarily the largest. I mean, most of the focus has been on the effectiveness of peacekeeping, as you said, you know, that's been the debate for the past decade or so. And now, I guess, moving forward, do you see this as being part and parcel of the mandates, you know, these multidimensional missions that are now kind of the norm, if we see, you know, in the latest deployments? And if so, do you think peacekeepers may have, you know, an increasing role in protecting certain structures, like they have done already for water supply and sanitation, but for other cases like pipelines, for instance, or things that may be strategic to protect in order to avoid further environmental damage? And, you know, this is not an invitation to speculate, but just to see, in terms of what you've analyzed in the mandates and what you've seen in the 17 cases you studied, if there has been an evolution in being more specific and very vocal and descriptive about the things that peacekeepers should be able to protect beyond civilians, of course. So with that, I'll stop there. And I think the question from Pavel Prokovic in the chat was about, are there any successes, Juliana and Hector, that you have seen already in criminal proceedings when it comes to environmental issues? And if you can think of, you know, other examples that we might want to cite when we are talking about this in other fora or settings, just because we want to see this ecocentric approach succeed. So we'd like to hear if you have any examples from that. So that's all for me, and I'll turn it over to Alejandro, maybe Hector and Juliana, if you'd like to start us off.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Very briefly, we don't have much time. I think in the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court, what I expect to see in the present and coming years is more and more cases dealing with the environment. When the Inter-American Court issue an advisory opinion, it will take it into account within its jurisdiction on contagious cases. So individuals will use more and more the advisory opinion in their litigation practices for the protection of the environment. What I will expect to see as well is, in connection with this Escazú agreement that you mentioned, is as well through the systemic interpretation of the used by the Inter-American Court, to the court make more reference to it, especially in connection with the participation and consultation processes on environmental matters that should take place before decisions of national authorities be taken on those issues. So I see that we will discuss more and more within the Inter-American system environmental issues, but be aware that cases take a long time. So could take between 9 years before a case reaches the court. So we need to wait until the jurisprudence will address more and more these issues. But I'm very confident. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. Hector and Juliana, over to you.
Well, thank you, Emmanuel, for the questions, and to everybody for the attention. Regarding the Inter-American system and the pressure to the transitional justice mechanisms in Colombia, specifically the special jurisdiction for peace, it is important to have in mind a difference. No? Inter-American system, it's for state responsibility, and special jurisdiction for peace is individual criminal responsibility, right? So that give us a different and legal analysis of the situation, because I think that the special jurisdiction for peace has the challenge to find out the nexus, no, between the action, the criminal action, and the responsibility, and therefore to try to classify that in a criminal conduct, right? But what is important, and I think that Alejandro has presented very nicely, and And I think that it's very nice to have these standards that of inter-American system, because can be a standard for the special jurisdiction for peace to analyze the responsibility and the affectations and the possible sanctions, right? And I think that it could be a really good framework for trying to help to facilitate to the special jurisdiction for peace the mandate. I will say also, and I think that related to the second question, like the chat question, and I give some minutes to Hector to say that right now the jurisprudence of the special jurisdiction for peace is focused in the indigenous territories and the special affectation of nature in relationship with the indigenous communities in Cauca and Nariño regions, right? So I think that it's following the same narrative of the Inter-American Commission there, and I think it will be a good bridge and between the two courts. So I don't know, Hector, if you want to say something more there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Juliana. And regarding that question about like a positive experience investigating environmental crimes, well, that's something that's in a very early stage in Colombia. But again, for the situation of the special jurisdiction for peace, I think that they are also showing interest, particularly the attorney office assigned to the special jurisdiction for peace. They are also asking the questions how to be better equipped to investigate criminal environmental crimes, and that's a question that, for example, includes like you need like natural sciences professionals that are able to assess impact on species, fauna and flora species, and so that requires a different set of tools to assess the impact on ecosystems, and that's something that it's starting to have some like steps forward in the attorney office of the special jurisdiction for peace, but it remains to be seen like how this will like materialize. For example, in the case 02, which we were commenting on. Thank you.
Very insightful. Thank you both for that reflection. And I know in the spirit of time, I want to make sure we can go over to Mariana, if that's all right, so we can get your impressions and response to a larger conversation, but also maybe the questions that I raised. And so, yes, over to you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So to answer your questions on visibility and whether there's an interest on creative bridges, indeed, one of the key concerns and one of the key motivations behind most types of support and even our own efforts is that we've seen that environmental defenders at least start basically alone, trying to struggle against well-entrenched power structures, and that increases a lot the vulnerabilities and the threats they face. So a key concern is how to reach those defenders who are most isolated and therefore more disconnected from support sources, who are less visible, and visibility, as that you mentioned, is indeed key. It has to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis, because in some cases may even increase the risk that a defender faces, but visibility does have a preventative function as it increases the political cost of attacks, and therefore visibility is very, very important in multiple cases. But as I said, it's something that has to be concerted with the defenders. So even though we all are aware of the importance of raising visibility, particularly of rural defenders and indigenous defenders, that is something that has to be very, very cautious. And it has not only this preventative function, but it can also serve to catalyze and to help access justice. So I think the best well-known case is Berta Cáceres. Perhaps without all the visibility that the case got, we've never seen such a successful investigation going to the intellectual authors of the crime, and it's yet to continue. We're yet to see that it does reach out everyone who's needed to be reached, but that's also important in terms of the visibility. And in terms of the bridges and created networks, that's also a key concern. And these networks are key sources of support. Network catalyze solidarity. Networks are crucial in the trust building processes, in the referral processes to access funding, digital security trainings, for example, well-being. Most of the international civil society organizations who provide the support work on a referral-based cases. So networks are key to that. And in Colombia, that you mentioned the case, there are great networks of defenders. We all know many of them. And so a key concern is how to strengthen those local networks that are most in contact with local defenders, who are in turn able to reach out to the most isolated communities. And that's perhaps the key concern. So how do international organizations and how do we all international actors talking about increasing support for local defenders are able to match oral discourse and our resources with such complex realities? Because on the ground, sometimes even intermediary and local organizations are not able to reach out to these communities, to these defenders, until sometimes it's too late. So until the National Human Rights Institution publishes their attack, and then you go and work with them. So that's also the case, the reason why it's being such a reactive rather than a preventative approach. And key to adopting a more preventative approach is reaching out to isolated defenders in time, which is of course linked with visibility. They sometimes don't have the resources or even the knowledge to make themselves visible enough.
Thank you so much, Mariana. And maybe there is an opportunity, as Alejandro was mentioning in the chat, for academia to play a larger role in being a little bit more militant and using the resources of research institutions in the global north that we know are, very abundant, to be able to go to these communities and be able to raise the profile of these struggles, so that it doesn't really stay in just domestic efforts, and that it can transcend the borders and inform a broader conversation, not just in the region, but also to inspire and to demand for action at the policy level. So hopefully there can be those linkages made from the local to the global through maybe academia could be a good avenue for that. I'm mindful of the time, also making sure that we get some comments from Tobias on the future of peacekeepers and their mandates and sort of their relation to protecting or ensuring a better environmental quality. So is there something that you can see, Tobias, already happening or shaping up in terms of trends in the mandates? And if so, where do you think that direction will be? And are there variations depending on the type of conflict? Just very curious to hear where you think the research program will go.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Excellent question. So when comparing the current mandates with earlier ones of the, let's say, early 2000s, you do see that environmental components, have become more prominent, so are more frequently mentioned. And you see that they have also become more specific. And I think this trend is not going to change in the future, quite the opposite. It will intensify in terms of both importance and also specificity, so to speak. And I think the main reason for this trend in peacekeeping mandates and the corresponding impact of peacekeeping troops on environmental quality is that senior UN bodies and actors, so Secretary General, Security Council, General Assembly, more and more become aware of this link between climate change and conflict. So even so there is not so much evidence for a direct impact, but quite a lot for indirect effects from climate change via, let's say, economic development to conflict as such. These UN bodies then basically realize, okay, if we do something for climate change adaptation, if we do something for addressing the changes in the environment stemming from climate change, we actually do something about conflict. And because of this realization that has gained so much prominence in over the last few years, I think this trend of referring to environmental aspects in mandates in terms of both substance and frequencies and also specifications will actually increase, will be more important, and I think you will see then a greater impact of peacekeeping troops on environmental outcomes.
Absolutely, yes, we hope to share the same the same vision in the next few years to see more progress in the space, even if we know that, in terms of the climate, at least conversation, the Security Council is still not yet at the point where they can agree on what are those risks for conflict prevention strategies. But all of you, thank you so much for sharing your research, and we look forward to keeping track of where your research programs go, and because this is really the cutting edge of the environmental peace building field in terms of rights and justice, and also the ways that in the international community with their peacekeepers and the larger operations efforts can lead to better protection and preserving the quality. So all of you, we thank you again on behalf of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and the United States Institute of Peace, and we look forward to seeing the rest of your work and to provide more opportunities like this for exchanges and dialogues to take place. We'll stay in touch, and we'll hope that everyone has a great weekend coming ahead. And I think with this, we can close up the conference for us in this session. And we'll be able to look forward to keeping in touch and making sure that we can continue to track each other's work. So thanks again.
Thank you.